So I am the technology architect for Fairfax County Public Schools, which is a large school district just to the west of DC. I'm here today speaking on my own behalf rather than speaking for my district. So you will get the full force of my very opinionated viewpoints on student privacy and security. I appreciate everyone sticking through to this somewhat technical last session of the day. So it's always dangerous to have security packet capture images between your audience and drinks. So I promise there will be no quizzes. But I did want to take a little bit of time to talk about security and privacy from a technologist perspective. We spent a lot of time today talking about the policy view and talking about laws. And we've talked a lot about the administrative controls. But we haven't really talked about the technological controls. And often in my experience, there is a world of difference between what is being said is being done in an application when you look at the privacy policy and when a technologist looks at what the actual behavior of the application is. And sometimes those two are very, very different. So you've heard the term reasonable methods or reasonable security a couple times in today's piece. And I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean when we say reasonable security or reasonable privacy in the context of EdTech. And part of that goes to who actually gets to decide that? And if you're in a school district, often you don't have a lot of control over who gets to decide. But here, as thinking as a school district person, here are some of the people that kind of weigh in on that conversation about what reasonable security might be. Certainly the vendor community, people in my community, teachers, central IT, certainly school board members, parents have very strong opinions about what is reasonable security. We talked a little bit today about lawmakers and regulators in terms of reasonable methods or reasonable security. And the media and advocacy groups are certainly places that you will hear a lot about reasonable security. And they each have varying takes on what that might mean. And lastly, there are professional organizations such as NIST and other security frameworks that will contribute a lot to the discussion about reasonable security. More and more, we're seeing a few trends around applying those industry standards to EdTech security. So, for example, a recent law in New York, and my understanding is some of the proposed regulations for implementing will reference, the current legislation references security standards that are in HIPAA, the health privacy law. And more recently, the New York law and Connecticut and several other states in proposed legislation are referencing some of the NIST security frameworks for requirements for either vendors or districts to comply with. So there is an increasing either maturity or increasing awareness of using industry common frameworks for security in EdTech. As we get into this conversation about security, one of the things that vendors need to be aware of is as the conversation around privacy and security has evolved over the last 5 or 6 years, more and more districts are getting pressure on them to examine and vet their technologies. And more districts are becoming familiar with the conversation around security and privacy and what to look for. This is both a pro and a con. These are useful but complex tools. So as a vendor, you may have districts that are becoming more and more familiar with how to vet a piece of technology for security and privacy. One of the common places that a district will look is in COPPA and in FERPA. They'll look at the COPPA FAQ, and there's some useful questions for districts to ask their education technology vendors about security. So this is commonly districts are looking at this. and that's guiding some of the questions that, that they're asking vendors in terms of how they vet. So being able to answer basic questions like what kinds of personal information you're collecting, what third parties you're sharing that information, how are you protecting that information. So having information and either in your privacy policy or in separate informational briefs that you can provide to a district and to parents on how you are protecting that information and providing some level of detail on that. Districts are also starting to use tools that are available on the public web for evaluating and testing applications. In one of the earlier presentations, the topic of looking for a proxy for quality, or looking for a proxy for something is good came up. And there are a number of tools that districts will use because they're relatively easy to use. You pull up a web page, you put in a URL, and it'll give you an answer. And we're all pressed for time, and we're all looking for kind of easy, simple answers. Let's just test this and put in a URL and see what the answer comes up with. And some of these are useful. They do require a bit of technical understanding to interpret, but it's important to understand that districts are using these tools to judge a vendor's technology. And you want to make sure that, one, your product measures up to the tools that districts are using, and also that you provide, in your information, explanations about how your tool stacks up against this. So, for example, we're looking here at a report from SSL Labs, which is a tool that several districts use to gauge the quality of an SSL or TLS, an encryption certificate for encrypting the traffic from a browser to a web server. So this scores the quality of that certificate. Is it designed to protect against current attacks? What the expiration, what the strength of the certificate is. And that's a good heuristic that districts will sometimes use to kind of take a quick litmus test on the overall quality of a vendor. It is by no means a comprehensive test, but I think it's important to understand that this is something that districts will use as a litmus test to measure the overall security quality of a vendor by looking at one specific thing. There are several of these, SSL Labs, Privacy Score, Security Headers, each measure different things, and they are kind of useful tools for an external person like a district to be able to look at the security of a web-based vendor's tools. PrivacyScore.org is another one that measures a whole battery of tests. So I think it's important to understand that districts are using these tools to judge your products and understand what it is that these are testing for. So for example, here we look at, it scores what third-party trackers are being used in the product, and that's important for gauging the privacy of an application. So when you look at, when a district looks at a report like that, the next thing that they're going to do is they're going to turn to your privacy policy and see, are you disclosing that you're using these trackers? Are you clearly identifying that you're using Google Analytics for purposes of tracking visitor sites and analytics, and perhaps that you're doing IP address anonymization and how you're configuring these third-party trackers to protect users' privacy. I think these are a number of things. They go into much more detail, secure cookies, email setup, and it can be quite comprehensive. So that's kind of a quick test. If you look at what a more comprehensive set of technical vetting might look like, and this is based on my district, some of the things that we look at, and many districts will have some basic pass-fail criteria. I think in 2019, at this point in time, it's a pretty reasonable expectation that a vendor is encrypting their traffic between a browser or a mobile client and their web server. And many of my peers have that as kind of a hard, bright red line for pass-fail for any product that is dealing with sensitive information. We'll also look at account creation. How are accounts created? Rostering, who in the district has to create the accounts, and specifically there, is data minimization being followed? Or is the application on account creation collecting the minimal amount of information when the account's being created, and later looking at is the minimal amount of information being collected during use? Looking at how information is shared, and this is particularly useful in applications where the student is generating student content, user-generated content. Is there sharing or communication between students, between users? Is data being shared outside of that system? And how, in the data that's being collected, what kinds of data is being collected, and doing a data mapping activity and looking at all of that application. This is something that can be done at a basic level if you're a customer, if you're a district that's looking at something. I think as a vendor, you want to go much more deeply internally when you're looking at securing your product and have a very thorough, documented understanding of the data mapping in your EdTech product. What data is being collected, how that data is being used, where that data is being shared inside, between applications that you have, and outside to external vendors. So those are some of the things that a larger district might look at when they're vetting educational technology products. Very large districts, like some of the ones that you heard from today, may even need to do load testing and vulnerability scanning. The majority of districts are relatively small, around 3,000. So the average product is not built for a district like that is 130,000, 190,000. So some districts may do load testing, or may need to hear from you on how, as a vendor, that you've done load testing. That's both from a performance piece. When you think about security, we think about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when you think about availability, that's really what goes to load testing. Is the product available under load? Can you break the application? So that's some of the testing that you might see a large district either do or ask to see some validation tests that you've done for supporting load testing. One group that has done a lot of work around security and security testing is the privacy group in Common Sense Media. About 2 years ago, they produced a report for how a district might set up and do technical testing on their own using a technique called proxy analysis. So putting something in between the user and the website, and capturing and looking at the traffic, which is kind of one of the best ways of seeing what's going on for an outsider. So it walks through a number of different tests that a district might do, and I think this is a good map for a vendor for the most basic set of tests that you might be doing as a vendor. This is by no means comprehensive of what a school should expect a vendor to do, but this represents kind of the bare starting point for testing, making sure that all traffic is encrypted. Looking at the email traffic and making sure that email is encrypted. Looking at cookies and making sure that information in cookies is secure. And then there are certain things in terms of mobile apps that have some unique testing requirements. And many applications use APIs, use sending information back and forth between a client and the server in ways that can potentially expose information. So I think this is a good blueprint for a basic set of tests, and some districts have started using this to do basic testing of their applications. Common Sense has also incorporated some of these basic tests in the privacy reviews that they're doing. we kind of talked about places that districts look at to get signals for approval, whether they're looking at the list of applications that have been approved by their peers, or in this case, a trusted third party that has credibility on the educational review side that has now started reviewing the privacy policies of applications. One of the things that they will score an application, and they have similar kind of red line as I mentioned earlier. So for example, an application that is not recommended because in this case, it does not use use encryption. It's worth pointing out that this one also mentions that the site does not force the use of encryption. So there's a difference between an application can support encryption. So if I type HTTPS and I go and it's encrypted, that's one thing. That means it can use encryption. But one of the things that's important to check for is, does it force it? So what if a user were to just go to the non-HTTPS, if they just type in HTTP? Does that work? Or does the site automatically redirect them to make sure that they use the secure piece? So in testing, it's important to test the positive case. Does it work as expected? But also testing, what's the behavior when you do something that's not expected? And then does that keep the user secure? So that's an example, forcing encryption of a test that tests for that. So I mentioned proxy twice. So I mentioned talking about schools using other things as a proxy, as a signal, using a third-party test or a list of district apps as a proxy. But there is a much more technical meaning of that term. A proxy is an application that sits in the middle between my browser and an application that I'm testing, and it captures all of the traffic and sends them forward. So it's a testing tool to use that gives you a good view inside of what's happening in an application. And this is really one of the best ways to see what's going on. I realize that this is not something that is easily seen from a distance, but this is basically every piece of communication that's going back and forth between the browser or the web client and the server. And usually these are very insightful in terms of comparing what a vendor says they're doing in their terms of service and what the application is actually doing. If I see terms of service that doesn't list any third-party plugins, and I get an indication from using an extension that says there might be 4 or 5 plugins in use, the next thing that I might look at is I might look at the traffic that's going back and forth, and I might see that data is going to Google Analytics or going to this third-party service that is capturing the behavior and the movement of the user as they move across the page, and it's giving the exact position of their mouse, and this is something that that developers use to basically replay the application. That can expose a lot of information. It can take screenshots. So getting an idea of all of what's going on here. So for example, here in this particular example, they're using Google's double-click advertising server, setting a cookie here, and you can see that information is being transferred out to DoubleClick. So this is a way that you can look, and I would strongly recommend looking at your product and making sure that you understand everything that's going on in terms of the traffic. Regularly, when I look at this, I find something that I have a question about, and the conversation with the developer goes usually something like, oh, we did that in development and we never took it out. We thought that was only in the sandbox, or we thought that was only in the development environment, or oh no, it's not doing that, and then I'll pull up a packet capture and say, well, yes, it does actually seem to be doing that. And it's important to be able to explain these things. So one recent example I had was a conversation with a vendor that, as many products do, have the ability to share content out to Facebook and to email and to Twitter. And this is just my own personal opinion. For me, in 2019, I view connections to Facebook with extreme prejudice, with high suspicion in terms of being able to justify the legitimate educational purpose of an application that is connecting to that service. And I think districts should be very clear on questions about an application that appears to be doing that and understanding why it is doing that and what data is passing back and forth. In this particular case, the application had the ability to create content, picture, a post, whatever, an infographic, and post that to the user's Facebook page. Required the user turn on the API, the setting in Facebook that lets third-party applications talk to it. And when I looked at the traffic that was coming down from Facebook was my entire friend list, detailed information about them and their relationship between me and them. So I actually got permission from my father to use his screenshot with his relationship with me as my father. So I actually have a technical report where my father has acknowledged his relationship with me. So that is in a privacy impact assessment. So this was something that the vendor was not aware was going on when I talked to their legal folks. And I'm still waiting on an answer as to what is going on, and is this information that is strictly going down to the browser, or is it being passed on? The important thing to understand when we're having this conversation around what someone that is vetting your application can see as a third-party observer is, most of the time, the most that I can say is, I see something unusual and I'm concerned and I want you to explain it. And I'm a little suspicious. It doesn't necessarily mean that something bad is happening, but it's important to be able to be very clear what's going on. In many of these cases, I'll see a third party and it's being used for analytics or it's being used for site improvement, and data is not necessarily being shared, or that a plugin is installed but it's not being activated. But it's important to list what third-party services you're using in your privacy policy. When these kinds of questions are not easily answered, it's very, very important to be able to be clear on this. This is something I see regularly. I saw an example of that same company using a second-party data provider where they were pulling down information to basically enrich the profile. It was pulling down company information on my school. The obvious question is, why would you be doing that unless you're building a profile, which is something that is prohibited for building user profiles unless they're for educational purposes. So I think this is an excellent place to kind of start digging into your product when you're looking at doing a privacy impact assessment, because this is not what you say you're doing, this is what you're actually doing. The other way that I like to think about privacy and security is thinking about it in the developer's lifecycle. So this is by no means comprehensive, but I wanted to give a few things at the different lifecycle stages to think about. So thinking about security in the design phase, when the product's being developed, or in a sprint as the product's being improved, thinking about how the product does authentication. If you're doing native authentication, minimum password lengths, the number of times that I've tested a product and I can put in the number 1 as a single character and that's accepted as a valid password is a very large number of applications. So enforcing password complexity that's appropriate to the sensitivity of the data that you're collecting in the application is important. But also, if you don't have to manage passwords, supporting some kind of federated authentication like LDAP or SAML or login with Google. But more and more for systems that are storing sensitive data, districts are looking for the ability to support two-factor authentication, if only, especially for, but most importantly for administrative accounts. So in in a large enterprise system like a student information system, an HR system, a data warehouse, a learning management system, having the ability to require folks that have administrator access, that two-factor authentication, an application on a phone preferably rather than SMS, or a token to support and require two-factor authentication. In the application design process, we talked a little bit before about data minimization and only collecting the least amount of information. Thinking about profiles and whether or not profiles are public, whether or not profiles have the ability to upload a photo, and is your application stripping out the geographic information, the meta tag information in those photos, because that can disclose personally identifiable information. How auditable is the application if there is a security breach? Can I, as a school administrator, have access to the information that I need to do a security investigation, or do I have to rely on you and involve your technical folks in the investigation? One of the things we talked a little bit in one of the other panels about the term freemium, and when we think about privacy or security, I've seen several examples that are troubling in where privacy is a premium feature for applications, where the ability to make something private is either not the default, or in a freemium, where privacy is a premium, where it's not possible in the free level of the product. And I think that's a significant design flaw in a freemium application. I understand the need to have levels of a product, but I think for some things, privacy and security should not be premium features when you're dealing with EdTech. I have seen examples of things that are features that are actually bugs. We had a vendor that had a calendar product where all of the calendars were made public by default. And one of the most well-known ones in my district was a product that had a classroom roster structure. Teachers had classes, had students in them, and for convenience sake, and there's a lot of security sins that get swept under they get put under the umbrella of convenience and making it convenient for teachers. And there's a balance because classroom time is precious. But this particular application gave the ability for any teacher to reset a password for any student in their class, which seems like a great and convenient feature. But a lot of security attacks are chained attacks, where you do one thing and then you chain it with another and you chain it with another, and then you get elevated access. So this feature also had another very common classroom feature. A teacher could also enroll anyone in the system in their class. So when you combine that with a student, a teacher, a Post-it note, and a superintendent, you get a 5th grader having a teacher's password, enrolling the superintendent, and resetting the superintendent's password. And then it's not a feature anymore. Then it's a bug, and it's a Washington Post story. So thinking about features and how they could be used from an adversarial point is an important part of the design. And we talked a little bit about knowing what's in your application. And in the last couple years, this has become a much bigger issue, the issue of third-party libraries, of putting third-party products as code libraries in your application, whether it's a web application. This is very, very common in mobile apps. And I'm talking beyond trackers. I'm talking full-blown third-party code libraries. It's other people's code. And you don't necessarily know what all is going on in there. They can get included, they can get copied, and it builds over time, and it means that you no longer have a good data map of what's potentially don't have a good data map of what's going on in your system. There have been a number of good academic research papers about this. One in particular looked at Android apps in the Google Play Store that were targeted for the COPPA protected or children's child-safe applications, and they looked at the application libraries the third-party application libraries that were used by the applications and what data they collected. And the article presumed that there were a significant number of potential COPPA violations. There are third-party tools. This one is from a nonprofit called Exodus. I believe this was the one that was in the Berkeley research paper. So this one you can put in the name of the product, and it lists the third-party libraries that they can find they find the code signature for. It lists, in this case, since this is the Android platform, this is the platform level permission. So it's getting network access. It has the ability to read storage. But most importantly, kind of potentially, what are the privacy potential risk of third-party libraries? So here, this one is using a number of analytics products, a performance management, Crashlytics, mobile analytics, but also Facebook Share, Facebook Login, Facebook Analytics. So being aware of what third-party libraries are used in the system is very important. A similar product from AppSense kind of collects similar but slightly different things. Again, this is available to any district that just goes to this website and types in the name of your product's mobile app, and they can form their own opinion about your product. So it's important that you be aware of kind of both of not just what libraries your applications are using, but that other people are kind of judging applications based on readily available information. This is one that I started using recently for web applications, looking at third-party trackers and looking at the flow of information. I like this one. It's kind of a nice-looking graphic, but it kind of demonstrates both the flow of information between third parties, but also the types of third parties. So the important thing here is there are lots of very legitimate uses for third-party services. For example, in the Lavender, we've got a CDN, or content delivery network. But some of them I would not want to see in an EdTech product. So we've got email marketing, advertising, retargeting, marketing platform, all things that would be concerning. Some things that I might ask about, but kind of what kinds of hosted libraries, and then A/B testing, some things that you might not expect to see in an EdTech product. Just another example. This is a good kind of data mapping example of looking at things in the design stage. In the testing stage, it's very difficult to generate good quality and useful testing data. It's also a very, very big risk. So using some kind of data masking or synthetically generated data when you're doing testing is very important. So again, just a recent and local example from a number of years ago. There was a third-party product, I believe that was an emergency response system that was used in a district not too far away from here. They had a publicly facing test environment that used data that was just a copy of their production data. The test environment wasn't adequately exposed, and that was the source of a data breach. So this is a significant thing to consider in testing. It's very important to do testing, but it's also important to either use masked or synthetic data, or very carefully lock down access to the testing environment. When things move into the application operation stage, making sure that you're monitoring traffic, that you're looking for intrusion detection, all of the kind of basic standard things in running a network operation center, but also looking at things that might be signals for attacks. Schools are big targets. We tend to have a lot of times we tend to have our list of employees public, because we're public organizations. So often you will see those public directories, those public phone lists and email lists being scraped. and those accounts being used to just pound on our authentication systems for logins. So being able to look at what's the geolocation of authentication coming in. Is it coming from someplace that's not local? Is it coming from the Far East? Is it coming from a place that you would not expect traffic coming from? Is it coming at an unusual time? Is it coming at a rapid frequency? Is it from an account that hasn't been used in a while, a lapsed account? Email is probably the biggest vector for security breaches. Email and people. And thinking about security also means thinking about the security that isn't necessarily part of the application. So thinking about the security of the email domain that is used to send messages. So, and this is separate from the actual application. So if the application is sending emails for password resets or sending emails for homework notification, how locked down is the email system? Are you using, these are 3 acronyms for standards for locking down and authenticating and verifying email. So is it easy to spoof the email address of your organization and send something that looks like a password reset or a mandatory you must change your password from admin at your favorite edtechcompany.com? Those are very easy ways to compromise our teachers. And then looking at change management. You migrate a server to a new network operations center. How clean is the configuration? My district was involved in an incident a number of years ago where a server was moved to a new data center. The FTP server, the file transfer server for uploading data to the system, was not properly configured, and it was left in what's called publicly directory browsable. So someone could just navigate to that server and navigate through the directory tree and navigate to the files and see all of the information. So this is a security incident that happens not because of the way the application was designed, but because of the way the operational activities were handled when something was moved from one place to the other. Again, I mentioned people. People are by far the biggest challenge in security, and there are very few applications that you can buy that are going to fix that particular problem. I can't buy a Bob-specific firewall to deal with that. So this is many times I give this presentation with Bill Fitzgerald, and this is one of his stories in dealing with a support forum, and a principal had posted to the support forum with an incident, and the support person dealt with the issue live in public in the support forum and provided them all the information that they would provide them on the phone, but provide them in a public forum, and including student personally identifiable information. And it was very easy, based on some information that was in the post, to identify what school this was about, and then what the student was. So we talk a lot of this has been kind of graphs and acronyms and protocols, but kind of one of the biggest parts of security is going to be people. So what do you do? This is a large topic and by no means comprehensive, but some very good places to start is encryption. Encryption in transit is important, but that's easy. And that's easy for me to check. I can see that that's happening. If I only had one question to ask a vendor, the question that I would ask is, are you encrypting the data at rest? That's important for a couple reasons. It's one of the things that I can't check. I have to trust. I can't go to a website and type in a URL and say, this data is being encrypted on your servers. The other reason it's important is when you think about a data breach, encryption is one of the best ways to deal with a data breach, and in some states, appropriate encryption is a safe harbor for notification. Virginia, where I work, is one of the few states that has an education data specific data breach law. Most states have finance, health information, driver's license, that sort of thing. Virginia has an ed data specific data breach, and it does have an encryption safe harbor. We talked a little bit before about passwords, two-factor authentication for the vendors, administrators. There have been a couple examples. Recently, there was one in the news where support desk personnel were phished for their credentials for a major, well-known system and got access to administrative systems from the support staff. Two-factor authentication for admin accounts. Patching systems, I'm sure it's very well known. The Equifax security breach was due to a lapsed patching of a server. Keeping the patching up to date, performing regular vulnerability scans, and again, I mentioned paying attention to those third-party code libraries. Transparency is important in privacy policies, but it's also important in communicating what you're doing for security. It's very hard for the average person to know that you're protecting. So being clear about your security practices. It's very helpful when a vendor has white papers or FAQs. This is an example from a large learning management system vendor, and it talks about their testing process against kind of a top 10 list of vulnerabilities. This is the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, which is a common list of vulnerabilities in the security area. So this is their testing and how they test against each of these vulnerabilities. Another good practice is making it easy for security researchers to report that there's a problem. A lot of times it's very difficult to find a contact to report a problem with an application or a security vulnerability. So there's some potential legal jeopardy for the security researcher. So have a policy around reporting vulnerabilities. Provide a contact on your website for who to contact if you are reporting a security incident. There is an emerging standard called security.txt for how to post who to contact if you're reporting a security vulnerability. Some of the things I've seen with a couple vendors recently is using crowdsourcing for doing vulnerability testing. I have one that uses a service called BugCrowd for reporting vulnerabilities as an example. And if I can leave you with one closing thought, if I could ask for one thing from a vendor, and it would be, please do not store student data unencrypted at rest.
Thank you so much, Jim.
All right.